Hi. So I will be presenting challenges of printing books in the Guarani-Jesuit reductions. Just to introduce myself, I'm a graphic designer. I live here in São Paulo, and I work in digital humanities projects at the Polytechnic School at the University of São Paulo. What I will be presenting is part of a master's degree research. I'm interested in typography and minority languages of Brazil. And I thought it was important to take a historical interlude within this area by studying what was one of the first experiences of printing books in South America. This led me to studying the printing press of the Guarani reductions. As to this presentation, I will first introduce you to what were the Guarani reductions. Then, in response to the conference's theme, I will present the reductions printing press in terms of the challenges it faced, and to conclude, I will very quickly point to challenges we could derive from the Guarani experience to views in the history of typography in Brazil. So the conclusions might sound a little too local for the international audience, but I'm hoping the presentation will be an introduction to one important chapter of the history of typography in South America. The Guarani-Jesuit reductions was a missionary enterprise of the Company of Jesus in the region of the River Plate basin. That is the hydrographic basin formed by the rivers that flow to the River Plate. Reduction means reduced. So the reductions were settlements where people of different ethnic backgrounds were reduced to or brought together. And in the case of the Guarani reductions, the elements that brought these people together was a Jesuit version of the Guarani language and, of course, the conversion to the Catholic faith. In the 16th century, this area was known to be populated by the Guaranis. And as you can see in this historical map, there is the Guaranis area just below Brazil. Can you see there? Written Guaranis. After 1609, the first reduction were founded to the north. Then they moved south and grew in number. By 1680, the reductions were more concentrated, and in 1730, the region had its population peak distributed in 30 reductions. Each reduction had a church, a school, and workshops, and sometimes a library. They were economically and politically autonomous. All the material and labor for the constructions of the churches and schools were local. Churches were extremely decorated, and everything from the furniture to the saints' table linen, utensils for the Mass, and music instruments were made in the reductions workshop. Studies about the music and sculptures of the reductions are particularly numerous today. Each reduction was better at one art, and they provided the most qualified labor of the region. Nevertheless, as you can imagine, the reductions were profoundly marked by the contrast between the opulent churches and the houses and means of the population in general. So access to the schools and workshops was at a premium, reserved for boys only, and for those who were the children of people of the highest social strata of the local hierarchy. And before I continue, I should acknowledge that changing from this mode of life to this was by far the biggest challenge that local population faced with the coming of the Jesuits. So since 1609, at the time of the first settlements, the Jesuits wanted to print books in the reductions. Although they went through considerable problems trying to settle in the region and changing from one side to another, they wrote many times to Rome and Madrid, supplicating for the coming of a brother from France, Germany, or Flanders who knew the art of typography and printing. Despite the first pleas, it was almost 1 century later that the books were finally printed in the reduction. And the way they went around not having printing types was copying the books by hand as to make it look like print. A great variety of manuscripts were produced in the reductions. but the ones that simulated print became particularly famous in the accounts of the Jesuits. When they finally had two fathers who knew about typography come to the reductions, one from Spain and one from Austria, they built a printing press with local wood, and according to the bibliography, type was cast with an alloy of metal extracted in the region. The first book was printed in 1700, and there is no known copy of this book that survives today, but a German father said something about it in 1701. Types are not like the ones in European books, nonetheless they are legible. And then in 1705 came to light the book De la diferencia entre lo temporal y eterno, a translation of the Guarani language of Nuremberg's book. It is particularly famous for its 43 illustrations, some of which are adaptation of illustration of an early edition printed in Antwerp. Paper was a challenge too. It was expensive and coming a long way through the ocean and then overland to the reductions. And of course, they could not spare paper, so there was no such a thing as proof printing. Despite all the challenges, at least 12 titles and some pamphlets were printed in the reductions in 3 different locations. Of these, we can find copies today of 8 titles, the one that I already showed, and these 7. So to print these books, they needed types, of course, the last challenge. A sublime dimension of the Guarani printing press was present in the reports written by the Jesuits' father to Rome and Madrid and frequently read out loud for the amusement of an European audience. And it still echoes in what is written about the reductions books today. It is repeated over and over that all the sorts were cast in the reductions, from Updike and Fevre to today's catalog of the John Carter Brown Library, the library which holds the biggest number of books printed in the reductions. This is repeated. So for each one of the books, I separated the character set used in the running text, and from that I could establish that the types available to print them were 1 italic face complete character set, sizes approximately 14 points and 18 points, and 2 Roman faces complete character sets in the same 2 sizes. One can see that the print of some of these books is very precarious, so it was not always possible to find a good example for each one of the characters. Still, I could note that there were characters of the exact same size that had different forms. The variation of forms for characters of the same size was more visible in the bigger letters. So I separated all title characters, the ones that were bigger than those of 14 and 18 points, and did all kinds of comparisons. I compared characters of the same size and between different sizes and so on. There are letters in 7 different sizes, and this doesn't mean that there are 7 different faces. You can see, for example, 6 different forms for the character A and E of the same size. And it is rather challenging trying to arrange these characters together. These N and R are of different groups, but should I put the N with which one of these P's? This seems to go together. As a group, they look alike, but these A's are not quite the same, and the same goes for the R's. And it is important to note that these were being used together, sometimes in the same word. So looking at these books, it seems to me that sorts were all mixed together and that the Guarani typography had a miscellany of types of different faces used with no distinction. I won't dare say they were not casting type there, but it seems to me that at least part of the typographic material available was coming from elsewhere. Now, by way of conclusion, I would like to point to challenges or questions that we can derive from the study of the Guarani typography. First, what determines what a set is? Is it the repetition of individual features or the fact that despite the differences they ended up assembled in these books? And then a second, the historiography of Brazilian typography is sometimes obsessed with the coming of the royal press from Portugal to Rio de Janeiro in the early 19th century and repeatedly affirms that only one book was printed in Brazil before that, the famous Relação da Entrada que fez de Isidoro da Fonseca. And I wonder if the remaining architecture of the reductions present in the so-called Sete Povos das Missões in the state of Rio Grande do Sul is part of the history of Brazilian architecture, why aren't the books produced there part of the history of Brazilian typography? I think we could benefit in at least two ways if we incorporate this to our history. First, because we should welcome social uses of typography, in this case, highlighting the contribution of the Guarani people very much alive and part of our population to our history. And secondly, it could help us make sense of our graphic memory. I think the estrangement caused by the mixtures of seemingly different characters on the cover of the Guarani books and the difficulty in discerning the precariousness from intentionality is a feature of our graphics practice. Thank you for listening to me. I'm using Garibaldi. This is Garibaldi from Harbor Type, and this is the people I would like to thank.